In today's episode of the Investing Mastermind Podcast, Sina and I are so pleased and grateful to have spoken with Charlotte Janis, a granddaughter of legendary investor Benjamin Graham, and she is the creator and writer at beyondbengraham.com/blog. Her grandfather, Ben Graham, is renowned as the father of value investing and the mentor of Warren Buffett. We hope you enjoyed the following interview.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm one of 9 living grandchildren of Benjamin Graham, and I'm grateful for other Graham family members, for a wonderful uncle and aunt, and to have lovely fellow grandchildren. I'm long retired from my work as a registered nurse, family nurse practitioner, and health writer. I now have the privilege of working for myself for free as the creator and writer of beyondbengraham.com, a not-for-profit blog. And my jobs as a nurse, I worked in many different areas: emergency room, a student health clinic at a college. I wrote patient education materials. I taught wellness topics such as exercise and stress reduction. I often found myself helping people in times of crisis or times when they were really hurting. And looking back, I noticed that I've always been more interested in the inner life than the outer life, and really looking at what's going on inside people and the challenges that we face as human beings, and how we can find the questions, the deep questions of how we can find inner peace, equanimity, compassion for ourselves and for other people. My grandfather, Ben Graham, had a distinguished career in finance, but I knew him well after he left Wall Street. He left in 1956. And when I spent time with him, mostly in my teens and early 20s, he also was focused on the inner life. We had that in common. And also what he called the life of the mind, his avid reading and translations of the classics. But he wasn't interested in money or investing or outer success during that time of his life. And he had these qualities of friendliness and a sense of equanimity that I felt from him. And he inspired me to look for fulfillment, not through outer success, but through healing the heart and opening the mind.
Wow. And that brings us to, you've started blogging about your grandfather on the blog you mentioned, beyondbengraham.com. What inspired you to start blogging about Ben Graham?
Well, when I was just 16, my grandfather invited me to join him on a 3-week cruise that we met in Genoa, Italy, and it went through the Mediterranean. And then what was very exciting, all the way through the Bosphorus Strait, through Istanbul, and to 3 ports in the Black Sea that were Russian at that time. Every day of that cruise, he sat in a teak chair on the deck, and I would see him with his pen in hand, scrawling his memoirs onto a stack of paper. And he had tremendous focus, and he was really, really engaged with the work. Nothing would distract him, although he would look up and smile at me if I came by. And those scrawls became my grandfather's autobiography, which was published in 1996 by McGraw-Hill. It's now out of print, but people buy used copies online. It's called Benjamin Graham, The Memoirs of the Dean of Wall Street. And my mother is Ben Graham's eldest daughter, Marjorie, and she gave me a copy when it was first printed, and I saw his face smiling out at me, and it just brought back how much I missed him. And over the next 2 decades, I dipped into that book, and I read and reread chapters about his youth, and I just couldn't believe how difficult his boyhood had been. I mean, I had no idea. I knew him when I thought of him as rich and comfortable and happy, and he really went through difficulties. And he revealed and hid a lot, both in that memoir. He revealed moments that were like his worst memories, and then he would hide it in a sense and not act like everything was fine, in his writing about his boyhood. He was a survivor and he got through it. But, it included his father dying when he was 8, and his mother had to raise 3 boys on the edge of poverty. They had no breadwinner. He had to take multiple after-school jobs to help his mother buy food. I found it so moving, and I just became hooked on understanding what really happened to him, what his life was really like, and to get to know him more deeply through his memoirs. And then my mother gave me the gift of unpublished writings, family, personal letters, some unpublished writings. And so I felt like I got to know him in a way I never could when he was alive, in a deep way. And I know that there are many people around the world who revere my grandfather and admire his work, but also admire him as a person. And I realized that other people might be interested in this story that I was uncovering by reading deeply all these different sources I had. I also had my mother's oral history she gave me about what it was like growing up with him as her father. So I designed the beyondbengraham.com website with the help of a team, and I began to tell the story. I call it the story behind the legend because he's known as a legendary investor. And it's about the hardships and tragedies he faced and his remarkable evolution as a human being, which I find really inspiring. And I'm telling that story in short blog posts. And you can read about, in terms of the cruise, it started it with his writing his memoirs. And of course, he wrote his memoirs at other times too, because it took him a long time, I'm sure, to write what I consider a treasure trove, especially about his childhood. Otherwise, a grandchild has no access to a grandparent's life as a child unless they write about it. I did write about the cruise in my latest post, which is under reflections on beyondbengraham.com, about a postcard that Ben Graham wrote to Warren Buffett from our cruise, actually from Odessa on the Black Sea. And when I found that postcard, I was so surprised to find out that he wrote about me to Warren Buffett. Warren was 37 years old at the time. You can find that on the website under reflections.
That's really amazing. And like you also say, Charlotte, just getting to know your grandfather through his writing is absolutely amazing. I think that's super inspiring also, to think about future generations in that he wrote that. That's absolutely amazing. So I would like to know, what's one fond memory you have that makes you smile whenever you think about your grandfather?
We'd be sitting at a dinner table, or we went to see Picasso's castle when he lived in Aix-en-Provence, France. That was one of the nearby sites. And he'd suddenly begin to quote lines of poetry. And he'd do this all the time. He had total recall of untold number of verses in mostly classical and European poetry. He could recite in at least 5 different languages. When I think about his French accent, that especially makes me smile because it so sounded like New York, the way he quoted French or spoke French. But I remember he would quote Virgil, Horace, Catullus, Homer, the Greek poet Solon, Omar Khayyam, Baudelaire, a German poet named Heine. And often what he quoted were, if he was quoting in English, they were his own translations. He was a polyglot. He could read many languages, including Greek and Latin, and he loved translating poetry. And at the time, I would roll my eyes and go, oh, here he goes again. Sometimes it would be one short line that would be completely relevant to, the wine we were tasting or the view or the beauty, and other times it would go on for a very long time. But now it makes me happy to know that he followed his passion for poetry and for translation and for the classics. And sure enough, after he closed his Wall Street office when he was 63 years old, and he pretty much stopped investing in the stock market, he was free to do what he loved to do. And at that time, he chose to translate the Iliad from the Greek. So it makes me smile to think of him quoting that poetry.
And that's incredible, because so many of us who don't know him personally, we would have never imagined that he was a polyglot with such an appreciation for literature and the classics. And growing up, were you aware of the significance of your grandfather's work in the field of investing?
No, I wasn't aware at all. I knew that my mother adored him and deeply respected him. And she was his eldest daughter. They had a fond relationship. And I knew when I was a kid, a child, I was very aware that he was rich because I did visit him when he had a Beverly Hills home that looked like the home of a wealthy person. It was large. It had big columns, white columns out front. It had a swimming pool, which was a really big deal for me. that was azure blue and shimmery, and there was a palm tree that hung over it that looked very tropical. And when I was a teenager and a young adult, he lived totally differently. He lived simply, half the year in a small condominium apartment in La Jolla and half the year in a modest cottage in X. And he did little or no investing during that time when I really knew him. And what's odd is that all that time I spent with him on the cruise for that whole 3 weeks, we had lunch and dinner together every day. It was a formal dining room setting back then. It was no buffet. You could sit down in the dining room and the waiters would bring you plates. And so we had a lot of conversations, but it was way more about Odysseus sailing the waters that we were sailing on the cruise, but we never talked about investing. And so he never mentioned his contributions. He taught me a card trick that involved complicated mathematics you had to do in your head, pick a card, any card, and he could go through the deck in less than 60 seconds and tell you what card you had, things like that. But I really have to say that I was quite ignorant of his work in the field of investing.
And that actually brings me to the next question, because were you influenced at all to learn about investing and personal finance because of the teachings of your grandfather?
No, I wasn't. I came of age in the late 60s, and it was an idealistic time when making the world a better place, things like ending segregation and racial discrimination and ending the Vietnam War were paramount on students' minds. And finding meaning was more important to me than making money. And also my inner struggles, and some of which I discovered later, that some of which I shared with my grandfather when he was a young person. I felt not good enough inside, as my grandfather did. I kind of discovered by looking deeply at his writings from his boyhood and when he was a young man. And I wanted to find a way to heal myself and transform my inner self. So when I was 17, I visited Ram Dass, the psychologist turned spiritual teacher, who at that time was living at his father's Vermont home, and I was going to college in Boston. And that visit cemented my determination to grow spiritually and not financially. So I really missed out on those teachings about investing.
I'm sure you've gathered some of it throughout your life, whether or not it may have directly come from your grandfather, and it's all right. Like, there's nothing that says that we all had to have necessarily learned how to do something. Like, our parent could be a nuclear physicist, but we might be more inclined toward the arts. So it's totally all right that sometimes it's just how we grow up. And for our listeners who are new to investing and might not know of Ben Graham, can you tell us, who was he, and not only as an investor, but also as a person and to you?
Yes, my grandfather, Benjamin Graham, was a Jewish immigrant. He came to America from England with his parents and two brothers who were a year and 2 years older than he when he was 1 year old. And his father started a New York branch of the family China import business. And that China shop prospered. And the family had a few boon years where they owned a very handsome 4-story brownstone in Harlem, which was a very fashionable neighborhood at the time. And they employed servants. And that happened between the years of Ben was probably 6 to 8. He had that experience. He had a French governess who took care of him. And then suddenly Ben's father died. He was 8 years old when his father died, and the China import business failed. His mother lost everything. And my grandfather, from then on, grew up on the edge of poverty in New York City as an immigrant. And financial hardship shaped him. He only could go to college on scholarship. He went to Columbia College on scholarship. And just before graduation, he was offered teaching positions in 3 different departments, which amazes me. I mean, how often does that happen with an graduate's college? He was offered faculty positions in Greek and Latin philosophy, in English, and in mathematics. And he was a scholar at heart, but he turned down those jobs because at that time they were low-paying jobs and would stay that way. And he had to support his widowed mother, his 2 brothers, and he wanted to marry my grandmother. So he took an entry-level job on Wall Street, and the pay was so low, he still worked as a tutor at night. He tutored sons of army officers, even a general. So he started out on Wall Street. He was even a board boy enjoy an entry-level position, and he soon distinguished himself as an original thinker. He saw that buying stocks was speculation, it was hit and miss, and he figured out that he could use company financial records to analyze the company to see that issued the stock, and that's how he invented security analysis. And also he invented the profession we now call financial analysis. And going a step further, he used security analysis and his own formulas to calculate which stocks were undervalued, that is, priced below their value on the stock market. And undervalued stocks were much more likely to increase in value over time, making them good long-term investments. In 1949, Ben Graham published a book called The Intelligent Investor, which has been revised and is still a top seller on Amazon. Warren Buffett calls The Intelligent Investor by far the best investing book ever written. And, over 1 million copies are out there all around the world. In 1950, Warren Buffett was the star student in Ben Graham's advanced security analysis class at Columbia School of Business. So my grandfather, in addition to managing a fund on Wall Street at that time, was a professor of finance at Columbia. And Warren Buffett went there to be Ben Graham's student. And then he went to work for Ben Graham on Wall Street in 1954. And he now sees my grandfather as his hero. So Benjamin Graham is famous today as the inventor of security analysis, the father of value investing, and the mentor of Warren Buffett. Now, there's a second part of your question, which was who Ben Graham is to me. And he was the friendly grandfather I spent time with who welcomed me and accepted me. He was my Grandpa Ben. And I saw him as a shining example of a person who had known hardship, suffered many personal tragedies and setbacks, and yet he was so hopeful and positive, and he smiled so much, and it was a genuine smile. And when I knew him, he had realized that material wealth didn't fulfill him or protect him, and he'd given up making money and asked himself what really matters. And he did his best to heal his wounded heart and was able to find love and happiness late in life, which is really, really unusual. And for that and a lot of other reasons, he's become my hero. I mean, he endured so many blows. He could have been broken. He could have been selfish, mean-spirited. He could have been greed-addled. He could have been lonely and unreachable. He had been much more remote when he was a younger man. People said he was much harder to connect with than during that time I knew him. And just getting to know that story of his struggles and his remarkable evolution has inspired me to start my website and blog, beyondbengraham.com. I write about this aspect of him as I call it, how Ben Graham became an inspirational figure, in a section on my website called About Ben Graham. And that's what he is to me today, the inspiration for my writing.
That concludes today's first episode with Charlotte Janis, the granddaughter of legendary investor Benjamin Graham. We'll be back next Tuesday with a continuation of our exciting conversation with Charlotte. Till next time.
If you enjoyed the show and found the content informational, we would be super grateful if you would leave us a review and follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you automatically get new episodes in your feed. We publish a new show every Tuesday.
The contents of the Investing Mastermind podcast are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. None of this is investing advice, and if you need help in your personal situation, please consult with a professional.